The living room was filled with the warm hum of family chatter, the smell of birthday cake drifting from the kitchen, mixing with the aroma of fresh coffee, and the faint scent of old wood from the furniture that had been in the family for generations. Elwood Callahan sat in his usual armchair by the window, the same chair he'd occupied every morning for the past 30 years, his weathered hands resting on his knees, fingers occasionally twitching with the tremors that came with age. 80 years old today. The number seemed impossible, almost obscene. He never thought he'd make it this far. Not after what he'd seen, not after the frozen forests of Belgium, not after watching so many young men fall who deserved this long life far more than he did. His grandson Garrett approached with a carefully wrapped box, Bennett close behind, both young men moving with a reverence that Woody didn't quite understand. The box was large, flat, wrapped in simple brown paper tied with string. "Open it, Grandpa," Garrett said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made Woody's chest tighten. Woody's fingers trembled slightly as he pulled away the paper, the string falling away to reveal a box he recognized immediately. His breath stopped. Inside lay his old army uniform, olive drab wool, the fabric still intact after all these years, smelling faintly of mothballs and memory. The Screaming Eagle patch of the 101st Airborne was still stitched to the shoulder, the white eagle's head fierce and proud against the blue shield. His hands hovered over it, afraid to touch, afraid that touching would make it all real again. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Evelyn kept it," his son Lawrence said from across the room, his own voice thick with emotion. "She told me before she passed that you might want to see it again someday. She said you'd know when the time was right." Woody ran his fingers over the fabric, the texture familiar despite the decades, and suddenly he wasn't in his living room anymore. The walls dissolved, the voices faded, and he was 20 years old again, standing on foreign soil with a rifle in his hands and terror in his heart. June 5, 1944. England. Somewhere in the countryside near the coast, the exact location kept secret even from them. The air was thick with tension and diesel fumes, heavy with the weight of what was coming. Woody stood in formation with hundreds of other paratroopers, their faces painted with war paint, dark stripes and patches that made them look like ancient warriors preparing for battle. Eyes fixed forward, jaws clenched, each man alone with his thoughts despite being surrounded by brothers. He was 20 years old, barely old enough to buy a drink back home in Pennsylvania, still young enough that his mother had cried when he left, but old enough to jump out of an airplane into Nazi-occupied France, old enough to kill or be killed. Next to him stood Virgil Pemberton, a farm boy from Iowa with a crooked smile that came easy despite everything, with hands calloused from years of working his father's land, and an unshakable optimism that Woody both envied and relied upon. "You scared, Woody?" Virgil asked, his voice low enough that the sergeants couldn't hear. Terrified, Woody admitted, seeing no point in lying. Not to Virgil. Not to the man who'd been through every training exercise with him, who'd shared rations and foxholes and fears. Virgil grinned, that crooked smile appearing like sunshine through clouds. "Me too. But we got each other's backs, right? We stick together. We come home together." "Right," Woody said, gripping his M1 Garand tighter, feeling the weight of it, the cold metal reality of what they were about to do. Right. They boarded the C-47 transport plane as night fell, the engines roaring to life with a sound that drowned out thought. Inside, the plane smelled of oil and sweat and fear. Men prayed, rosaries moving through fingers, lips moving in silent conversation with God. Some vomited into bags, their faces green in the dim light. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing, already gone to that place soldiers go when they know death is waiting. Woody closed his eyes and thought of home, of his mother's face as she'd waved goodbye at the train station, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth to muffle the sobs. He thought of the girl he'd kissed goodbye, Sarah, with her red hair and freckles, who'd promised to wait for him. He wondered if he'd ever see either of them again. The plane lifted off, joined by hundreds of others, a massive armada in the sky carrying the hopes of the free world in their bellies. They flew through the night, through anti-aircraft fire that lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks, through clouds and chaos. Then the red light turned green and the jumpmaster yelled, "Go, go, go," and they jumped into darkness, into history, into hell. Back in the living room, Woody's hand still held the uniform, his fingers tracing the stitching, the patches, the places where the fabric had worn thin. His grandsons watched him, concern etched on their faces, seeing their grandfather disappear into memories they couldn't access, into a past that was more real to him in that moment than the present. "Grandpa?" Bennett asked gently, leaning forward, his hand reaching out but not quite touching. "Are you okay? Do you want us to put it away?" Woody blinked, returning to the present like a diver surfacing from deep water, gasping slightly. He looked at the uniform, then at his family, at the faces of people who existed because he'd survived, because he'd made it home when so many hadn't. "I haven't worn this in over 60 years, he said. "Not since I came home. I put it in the closet and told myself I'd never look at it again." "Why don't you put it on, Grandpa?" Garrett suggested, his voice gentle but insistent. "Just for today. For us. We want to see you as you were. We want to understand." Woody hesitated. The weight of memory was heavy, heavier than any pack he'd carried across Europe, heavier than the gear they'd jumped with, heavier than the bodies he'd carried from battlefields. But something in his grandson's eyes, a genuine desire to understand, a need to connect with a past that was slipping away as the last veterans died, made him nod slowly. His son Lawrence moved to help him, but Woody waved him off. "I can do it. Help me to the bedroom. I'll change there." Normandy was chaos incarnate, hell given physical form. Woody landed hard in a field miles from his drop zone, his parachute tangled in a hedgerow, the thick bushes that crisscrossed the French countryside like a maze designed by a madman. Gunfire cracked in the distance, tracers lighting up the sky like deadly fireworks. Red and green lines of death crisscrossing the darkness. He cut himself free with his knife, hands shaking, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He was alone, completely alone, separated from his unit, from Virgil, from everyone he knew. The training kicked in. He moved through the darkness, using the cricket clicker they'd all been issued, a small metal device that made a clicking sound. One click, then waiting, listening. 2 clicks in response from somewhere in the darkness. Friend. He found 3 other paratroopers from different units, all lost, all scared, all trying to figure out where they were and where they needed to be. A sergeant from the 82nd Airborne took charge. "We move toward the sound of fighting. That's where we're needed." They moved together through the hedgerows, every shadow a potential enemy, every sound a threat. By dawn, they'd linked up with a larger group and were pushing inland toward their objectives. The hedgerows of Normandy became a nightmare maze of ambushes and close-quarters combat, each field a potential killing ground, each intersection a place where death waited. Woody learned quickly that war wasn't like the movies, wasn't like the training films they'd watched. It was mud and blood and the smell of death that never left your nostrils, that got into your clothes and your hair and your soul. It was watching men you'd trained with for months, men you'd drunk with and laughed with and shared your dreams with fall and never get back up. It was the sound of men crying for their mothers as they died, crying for medics who couldn't reach them, crying for a God who seemed to have abandoned this blood-soaked corner of France. It was Virgil pulling him behind a stone wall as machine gun fire tore through the air where he'd been standing seconds before. The bullets so close, he felt the wind of their passing. "I got you, brother," Virgil said, his face streaked with dirt and sweat and someone else's blood. "I got you. We look out for each other, remember?" Woody emerged from his bedroom wearing the uniform, moving slowly, each step deliberate. It still fit, though looser now on his aged frame, hanging where muscle had once filled it out. The brass buttons gleamed, polished by Evelyn's careful hands years ago, her way of keeping his past alive even when he wanted to bury it. On his chest were medals he'd never talked about, ribbons of color that represented moments of terror and courage, the bronze star with V device for valor, the purple heart with oak leaf cluster for wounds received, the combat infantryman badge that marked him as a man who'd faced the enemy and survived. On his shoulder, the screaming eagle patch. On his leg, the bloused trousers tucked into boots that had been resoled twice but never replaced. Lawrence stood and stared at his father as if seeing him for the first time, seeing not the quiet old man who did crossword puzzles and watched the birds at the feeder, but a soldier, a warrior, a man who'd gone to war and somehow came back. "Dad, I never knew you had all these medals. I never knew you were decorated. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Woody's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "I never wanted to talk about what I did to earn them. These aren't decorations, son. They're reminders. They're weights I've carried for 60 years. Garrett and Bennett moved closer, their eyes wide, taking in every detail. The uniform transformed their grandfather from the quiet old man into something else entirely. A piece of living history, a connection to a world they'd only read about in books or seen in movies. Bennett's eyes began to glisten with tears, his throat working as he tried to control his emotion. "Grandpa, what happened over there? What did you do? What did you see?" July 1944. The battle for Carentan, a small French town that became a crucial objective, a place where American paratroopers and German forces clashed in brutal urban combat. Woody's unit was pinned down in a drainage ditch, German mortars raining down with terrifying precision, each explosion sending shrapnel and dirt and pieces of men flying through the air. Men screamed for medics, their voices high and desperate. Others lay silent, beyond help, beyond pain, beyond everything. Woody fired his M1 Garand until his shoulder ached from the recoil, the rifle's distinctive ping as the 8-round clip ejected becoming a rhythm of survival, a metronome marking time between life and death. Virgil was beside him, laying down covering fire with his own rifle, both of them working in sync like they'd been born to fight together. "We gotta move, Woody. We're sitting ducks here. Another minute and we're all dead." They made the decision together, rallying 6 other men for a desperate push forward, knowing that staying meant death, knowing that moving might mean death. But at least it was action. At least it was doing something. They charged across an open field, bullets snapping past their heads like angry hornets. The sound of near misses a constant whine. Woody saw the muzzle flash of the German machine gun nest, saw the concrete bunker it was firing from, and threw a grenade with all his strength, the throw powered by adrenaline and desperation. The explosion silenced the gun, the crew killed or stunned. They took the position, but 2 of their men didn't make it across the field. Woody knelt beside one of them, a kid from Texas named Billy Hutchins who'd shown him pictures of his baby daughter just that morning, a little girl with blonde curls who'd never know her father. Billy's eyes stared at nothing, his mouth open in surprise, blood pooling beneath him. Woody wanted to close his eyes, wanted to say a prayer, wanted to do something, anything. Virgil pulled Woody away, his grip firm. "Come on, brother. We gotta keep moving. There's nothing you can do for him now. He's gone. We're still here. We gotta stay alive." But Woody kept looking back at Billy's body as they moved forward, kept thinking about that little blonde girl who'd grow up without a father, and something inside him hardened, crystallized into a cold determination to survive, to make it home, to make Billy's death mean something. Woody sat back down in his armchair, the uniform making him sit straighter despite his years, despite the arthritis in his spine and the pain in his knees. His family gathered around, forming a semicircle, waiting. For decades he'd kept these stories locked away, buried deep, afraid that speaking them would make him relive the pain, would open wounds that had never really healed. But looking at his grandsons' faces, at their genuine interest, their need to understand, he realized that silence had its own cost. These boys needed to know. The world needed to remember. If the last veterans died without telling their stories, without passing on the truth of what happened, then the war would become just another chapter in a history book, sanitized and simplified, the blood and terror and sacrifice reduced to dates and battle names. "I was a paratrooper in the 101st Airborne Division," he began, his voice steady but soft, each word chosen carefully. "We called ourselves the Screaming Eagles. We jumped into France the night before D-Day, June 6, 1944. I was 20 years old and thought I was invincible. I thought war would be glorious, that I'd be a hero, that I'd come home covered in medals and everyone would cheer. The war taught me different. It taught me that war isn't glorious. It's necessary sometimes, maybe, but it's never glorious." Garrett sat on the floor at his feet, Bennett beside him, both young men absolutely still, afraid that any movement might break the spell, might stop their grandfather from finally opening up after decades of silence. "What was it like, Grandpa? What was it really like?" "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," Woody said, his eyes distant, seeing not his living room but French hedgerows and Belgian snow. "We fought through France, through Belgium, through Germany itself. I saw things no person should see. I did things I'm not proud of, things that were necessary but that I'll answer for when I meet my maker. I lost friends, good men who deserved to grow old like me but never got the chance. Men with families waiting for them, with dreams and plans and futures that got cut short in an instant. And for 60 years I've asked myself why I survived and they didn't. Why did I get to come home when better men died? September 1944, Holland. Operation Market Garden, the ambitious plan to end the war by Christmas, to drop paratroopers behind German lines and seize bridges that would allow Allied armor to drive into the heart of Germany. The 101st jumped again, this time in daylight, which was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because they could see where they were landing, could see their objectives. A curse because the Germans could see them too, hanging helpless in the air, perfect targets. Woody landed in a field under fire, bullets cracking through the air, but he landed well, rolled, came up with his rifle ready. He assembled his squad, men he'd fought with since Normandy, faces he knew as well as his own. They moved toward their objective, a bridge over a canal, moving through Dutch farmland that looked peaceful except for the war tearing through it. The Dutch civilians cheered as they liberated towns, people emerging from cellars and hiding places, throwing flowers and offering what little food they had, bread and cheese and apples. Children ran alongside the American soldiers, their faces bright with hope, touching the uniforms, asking for chocolate. For a moment, Woody felt like a liberator, not just a killer. For a moment, the war seemed to have meaning beyond survival. But the fighting was fierce. German counterattacks came swift and brutal. SS units and Wehrmacht veterans who knew how to fight, who weren't ready to give up. Woody's platoon held a bridge for 3 days against overwhelming odds. Ammunition running low, casualties mounting, the perimeter shrinking as men fell. Virgil took shrapnel in his leg on the second day, a piece of metal the size of a thumb embedded in his thigh, blood soaking through his trousers. The medic dug it out with forceps while Virgil bit down on a piece of leather, sweat pouring down his face, but he refused evacuation. "I ain't leaving you guys," he said through gritted teeth as the medic wrapped his wound with gauze and sulfa powder. "We finished this together. We started this together, we end it together." They held the bridge. The armor came through, British tanks rolling past their positions, the crews waving and giving thumbs up. Operation Market Garden ultimately failed in its larger objectives. The bridge at Arnhem lost, thousands of British paratroopers killed or captured, but the 101st had done its job. Woody carried Virgil to the aid station himself, his friend's arm draped over his shoulder, hobbling together. "You're gonna be fine, Virg. You're going home. You're gonna see your farm again." Virgil smiled weakly, his face pale from blood loss. "Not without you, Woody. We both go home. Or neither of us does. That's the deal. That's always been the deal." "Why didn't you ever tell us these stories before?" Lawrence asked, his voice thick with emotion, with regret for all the years he'd thought his father was just distant, just cold, not understanding that his father was carrying a weight that would have crushed most men. Woody looked at his son, seeing the little boy he'd held as a baby, the toddler who'd reached up with chubby hands, the teenager who'd been frustrated by his father's silence, now a man with gray in his hair and grandchildren of his own. "Because I was ashamed," he said simply, the words hanging in the air like a confession. The room went silent, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the mantel, the same clock that had marked time through decades of silence. "Ashamed?" Bennett asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "But Grandpa, you're a hero. You fought the Nazis. You liberated Europe. You saved the world. How could you possibly be ashamed?" Woody shook his head slowly, his jaw working, fighting to find the words. "Heroes are the ones who didn't come home," he said finally. "Heroes are Billy Hutchins from Texas who never got to see his daughter grow up. Heroes are the men buried in cemeteries in France and Belgium and Holland, white crosses stretching as far as you can see. I'm just a survivor, and for a long time, I couldn't understand why I got to live when so many better men died. I couldn't talk about it because every memory came with guilt. Guilt that I made it and they didn't. Guilt that I got to have a life, got to have a family, got to grow old, while they're forever young, forever buried in foreign soil." Garrett reached up and took his grandfather's hand, the young, strong hand holding the old weathered one. "That's not your fault, Grandpa. You didn't choose to survive. You just did what you had to do." "I know that now," Woody said, his voice soft. "But it took me 60 years to accept it. It took losing your grandmother, the only person who really understood, to realize that honoring their memory, doesn't mean feeling guilty for living. It means living well, living fully, and making sure people remember what they gave. December 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble, a massive surprise offensive through the snow-covered forests, catching the Allies completely off guard. The Germans launched their attack with overwhelming force, tanks and infantry pouring through weakly defended sectors, and the 101st was rushed north to the Belgian town of Bastogne to hold the vital crossroads, a town that controlled 7 roads the Germans needed for their advance. They were surrounded within days, outnumbered 5-1, low on ammunition, low on food, low on medical supplies, and freezing in the worst winter Europe had seen in decades. Woody dug a foxhole in the frozen ground, his entrenching tool bouncing off earth as hard as concrete, his hands numb even with gloves, even with every piece of clothing he owned layered on his body. Snow fell continuously, heavy wet flakes that covered everything, covering the dead and the living alike in a white shroud that made it hard to tell them apart. Virgil shared his foxhole, the two of them huddled together for warmth, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, ice forming in their beards. "You think we're going to make it out of this one?" Virgil asked, his teeth chattering, his wound from Holland not fully healed, making him weaker than he'd admit. "We've made it this far," Woody said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. This felt different. This felt like the end. "We've been through Normandy, through Holland. We'll get through this too. We have to." The Germans sent a surrender demand on December 22nd, officers under a white flag delivering an ultimatum: surrender or be annihilated. The American commander, General McAuliffe, sent back a one-word response that became legendary: nuts. When the German officers asked what it meant, they were told, "It means go to hell." The siege continued. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper medical care. They died from cold, from exposure, from frostbite that turned fingers and toes black. They died from sheer exhaustion, falling asleep in foxholes and never waking up. Woody's feet were frostbitten, his boots frozen to his feet, his face chapped and raw, his lips cracked and bleeding. They ate snow for water and rationed what little food remained. A can of beans split between 4 men, hard crackers that had to be soaked in water to be edible. On Christmas Day, German artillery pounded their positions relentlessly, shells screaming in with methodical precision, the Germans knowing exactly where the American positions were, having them surrounded and targeted. Woody prayed for the first time since childhood, not for himself but for his mother, that she wouldn't receive a telegram saying her son was missing or dead. He prayed for Virgil, that his friend would make it home to Iowa, would see his family's farm again. He prayed for it all to end one way or another. Woody's voice grew quieter as he continued, his family leaning in to hear. Bastogne was hell on earth. We were surrounded, freezing, starving. Every day I woke up surprised I was still alive. The Germans had us completely cut off. We couldn't evacuate our wounded. We couldn't get supplies. We were running out of ammunition. Some units were down to 1 or 2 rounds per man. We fixed bayonets because that's all we had left. Bennett wiped his eyes, tears running freely down his face now. "How did you survive? How did anyone survive that?" "We had each other," Woody said, his voice firm despite the emotion. "That's what people don't understand about war. You don't fight for your country or for freedom or for democracy or for any grand idea. Those things are important, but they're not what keeps you going when you're freezing in a foxhole and you think you're going to die. You fight for the man next to you. You fight because your buddy is fighting, and you can't let him down. You fight because if you give up, you're not just giving up on yourself, you're giving up on everyone who depends on you. Virgil Pemberton was that man for me. He kept me alive, and I like to think I did the same for him, at least for a while, at least until I couldn't anymore." The sky finally cleared on December 26th, and Allied aircraft appeared overhead, beautiful and terrible, dropping supplies in multicolored parachutes that drifted down like Christmas presents from heaven. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, everything they desperately needed. The planes also pounded German positions, bombs and rockets tearing into enemy formations. On the 27th, Patton's Third Army broke through the encirclement from the south, tanks and infantry pushing through German lines, lifting the siege. The 101st had held. Against all odds, Against overwhelming force, they'd held the crossroads and denied the Germans their objective. But the cost was staggering. Of the men who'd arrived in Bastogne, nearly half were casualties, dead or wounded or missing. Woody looked around at the survivors, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes 1,000 years old, aged decades in a few weeks. Virgil was still alive, still smiling despite everything, despite the wound in his leg that wouldn't heal properly, despite the frostbite, despite the nightmares that came even when you were awake. We did it, Woody. We actually did it. They said we couldn't hold, and we held. They said we'd surrender, and we told them to go to hell. We did it, brother. They pushed forward after Bastogne, driving the Germans back through the snow and ice, taking back the ground that had been lost, pushing toward Germany itself. The Germans were retreating, but they were still dangerous, still fighting hard, setting up ambushes in defensive positions. Every town had to be cleared, every building checked, every corner a potential death trap. January 1945. A small Belgian village recently liberated, the name long forgotten. Just another dot on a map in a war full of forgotten places. Woody's squad was clearing buildings methodically, the way they'd been trained, the way they'd done 100 times before. Kick in the door, throw in a grenade, wait for the explosion, then go in shooting. Most buildings were empty. The civilians fled or hiding in cellars. Some buildings had German soldiers, either dead from artillery or hiding, waiting to surrender or to take a few Americans with them. Woody's squad was clearing a row of houses when German artillery opened up, the shells coming in without warning. The scream of incoming rounds the only alert. The first shell hit a building to their left, the explosion deafening, bricks and wood and dust flying through the air. The second hit the street in front of them, the concussion knocking men down, shrapnel singing through the air. Woody dove for cover behind a stone wall, his ears ringing, his heart pounding. The third shell landed directly on the building where Virgil had taken position, a 3-story structure that had probably been a shop or an inn. The explosion was massive, the entire building collapsing in on itself, walls pancaking down, a cloud of dust and smoke rising up. When the smoke cleared, the building was rubble, just a pile of broken stone and shattered timber. Woody ran forward, screaming Virgil's name, his voice raw, not caring about the artillery that might still be coming, not caring about anything except finding his friend. He tore at the debris with his bare hands, throwing aside bricks and beams, his hands bleeding, his nails breaking, other men joining him, all of them digging frantically. He found his friend buried under the stones, his body broken, his legs crushed, blood everywhere. Virgil's eyes fluttered open, blood on his lips bubbling with each breath. Woody? Yeah, Virg. I'm here. I'm right here. I got you. You're gonna be okay. We'll get you to an aid station. You're gonna be fine. But Virgil's hand gripped his with surprising strength, and they both knew it was a lie. Tell my folks I love them, Virgil said, his voice barely a whisper, each word an effort. Tell them I was brave. Tell them I didn't suffer. You were the bravest man I ever knew, Woody said, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the dirt and blood. You tell them yourself. You're gonna be fine. Just hold on. The medic's coming. Just hold on, Virg. But Virgil smiled one last time, that crooked farm boy smile that Woody had relied on through 2 years of war, the smile that had kept him going through Normandy and Holland and Bastogne. I'm glad it was you with me, Woody. I'm glad I didn't die alone. And then he was gone, his eyes still open but seeing nothing, his hand going slack in Woody's grip. Woody held his friend's body and wept, not caring who saw, not caring about being a soldier, not caring about anything anymore. Other men tried to pull him away, but he wouldn't let go, wouldn't leave Virgil in the rubble. Finally, his sergeant knelt beside him. Callahan, we gotta move. There's nothing you can do for him now. He's gone. Let him go. But Woody couldn't let go. He'd promised Virgil they'd go home together. He'd promised. The living room was completely silent, except for the sound of crying. Tears ran freely down Garrett's and Bennett's faces, both young men openly sobbing now. Lawrence had his hand over his mouth, his own eyes red, tears sliding down his cheeks. Even the air seemed heavy with grief, with the weight of a story that had been buried for 60 years. Woody's voice was barely a whisper now, his own eyes wet. I carried him to the graves registration unit myself. I wouldn't let anyone else do it. He'd carried me through the whole war, carried me through my fear and my doubt, kept me alive when I wanted to give up. So I carried him one last time. I carried him through the snow, through the ruins of that village, and I laid him down with the other dead. They gave me his dog tags, his personal effects, a wallet with pictures of his family's farm, a letter from his mother he'd never gotten to read. After that, something broke inside me. I kept fighting because that's what soldiers do, because the war wasn't over, because other men were depending on me. But the war was over for me in my heart. I was just going through the motions, waiting for a bullet with my name on it. I took stupid risks, volunteered for dangerous patrols, hoping that maybe I'd join Virgil, that maybe I wouldn't have to live with the guilt of surviving when he didn't. But the bullet never came. I made it all the way to Germany, all the way to the end of the war, and I never got a scratch after Bastogne. It was like God was punishing me by making me live. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. VE Day. Woody stood in a German town square as church bells rang and people celebrated, soldiers firing their weapons in the air, everyone cheering and crying and hugging. He felt nothing. He was hollow inside, empty. He'd survived, but he'd left pieces of himself scattered across Europe, in the hedgerows of Normandy where Billy Hutchins died, in the snow of Bastogne where so many froze, under the rubble of that Belgian village where Virgil took his last breath. He came home in September 1945, processed through a camp in France, then loaded onto a ship with thousands of other veterans, crossing the Atlantic in reverse, going home. He stepped off the train in Pennsylvania to find his mother waiting, older and grayer than he remembered, her face lined with worry and relief. She held him and cried, thanking God for bringing her boy home, and he stood there stiffly, unable to return the embrace, unable to feel anything. The boy who'd left in 1943 was gone. A harder man, a colder man, a man who'd seen too much, had returned in his place. He didn't talk about the war. When people asked, when they wanted to hear stories about the glorious liberation of Europe, he gave short answers and changed the subject. He couldn't explain that there was nothing glorious about it, that glory was a word used by people who'd never seen a friend die in their arms, who'd never had to keep fighting after everyone you cared about was gone. He got a job at a factory, working with his hands, losing himself in simple, repetitive tasks that didn't require thought. He married Evelyn in 1947, a quiet woman who worked as a nurse and who understood trauma, who'd seen men come back from the war, broken in body and spirit. She didn't push him to talk, didn't demand explanations for his nightmares or his silences. She just loved him, patiently and completely. They had a son, Lawrence, in 1949. Woody held his baby boy and felt a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe fear that he'd fail this child the way he felt he'd failed Virgil. He built a life, a normal civilian life, but the nightmares never stopped. He'd wake up screaming, back in Bastogne, back in that Belgian village, digging through rubble. The guilt never left. He'd see Virgil's face in crowds, hear his laugh in quiet moments. Why did I live and he didn't? The question haunted him for decades, poisoned every good moment, every happy memory. He couldn't enjoy his son's childhood because he kept thinking of Billy Hutchins' daughter who'd never know her father. He couldn't celebrate his own birthdays because Virgil never got to have another birthday after 22. He was a ghost haunting his own life. Evelyn was the only one who understood, Woody said, looking at the empty chair where his wife used to sit, where she'd sat every evening for 58 years of marriage until cancer took her 3 years ago. She never pushed me to talk, but she was always there when I needed her. She knew the war had taken something from me that I could never get back. She knew I had nightmares, knew I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and couldn't go back to sleep. She'd find me sitting in this chair, staring out the window, and she'd just sit with me. She didn't need to say anything. Just being there was enough. She loved me anyway. Loved the broken parts and the whole parts all the same. She's the one who saved this uniform, who polished these medals every year, who believed that someday I might be ready to face what they represented. I got angry at her once, found her in the closet with the uniform, and I yelled at her to throw it away, to burn it, that I never wanted to see it again. She just looked at me with those patient eyes and said, "Someday you'll want to remember. Someday you'll be ready. I'll keep it safe until then." And she did. She kept it safe for 60 years, waiting for a day I didn't think would ever come. Lawrence spoke, his voice choked with emotion, with regret. "I wish I'd understood when I was growing up. I thought you were just distant, that you didn't care about me. I thought I'd done something wrong, that I wasn't good enough. I spent my whole childhood trying to make you proud, trying to get you to notice me, and you always seemed so far away. I'm sorry, son," Woody said, his own voice breaking. "I did care. I cared so much it terrified me. Every time I looked at you, I thought about all the fathers who never came home, all the sons who grew up without dads. I thought about Billy Hutchins' daughter. I felt guilty for having you when Virgil never got to have children, when so many men never got that chance. The war taught me how to fight and how to survive, but it never taught me how to be a father. It never taught me how to love without fear, how to be present without being haunted by the past. I did the best I could, but I know it wasn't enough. I know I failed you." "You didn't fail me, Dad," Lawrence said, moving to kneel beside his father's chair. "I just didn't understand. But I understand now. I understand what you were carrying, what you've been carrying all these years. And I'm sorry I wasn't there for you the way Mom was." Garrett stood up, tears still on his cheeks, and did something unexpected, something that made Woody's breath catch. He stood at attention and saluted his grandfather, a crisp, respectful military salute, his hand sharp at his brow. Bennett immediately followed suit, standing and saluting, both young men honoring their grandfather in the way soldiers have honored each other for centuries. Then Lawrence stood and saluted as well, 3 generations standing at attention for the old paratrooper in his chair. Woody looked at his family, at his son and grandsons standing there honoring him, honoring the sacrifice, honoring the memory of all the men who didn't come home, and something inside his chest loosened, a knot that had been tied for 60 years finally coming undone. He slowly raised his hand and returned the salute, his arm steady despite his age, muscle memory from 7 decades ago taking over. "At ease," he said softly, his voice carrying the authority of the young sergeant he'd once been, and they lowered their hands. "Thank you for your service, Grandpa," Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for surviving so we could be here. Thank you for finally telling us your story. Thank you for trusting us with it. We'll never forget. We'll tell our children, and they'll tell theirs. Virgil and Billy and all the others, they'll never be forgotten as long as we remember." Woody looked down at his uniform, at the medals that represented blood and sacrifice and loss, at the screaming eagle patch that marked him as one of the men who'd jumped into darkness, who'd held Bastonia, who'd helped liberate Europe from tyranny. He thought of Virgil, of Billy from Texas, of all the men who never came home, who never got to grow old, who never got to sit in a comfortable chair and tell their grandchildren stories, who never got to see the world they'd fought to save. He'd carried their memory in silence for so long, afraid that speaking would dishonor them somehow, afraid that talking about the war would make it seem like he was bragging, like he was claiming to be a hero when he felt like a failure for surviving. But he understood now that the opposite was true. Silence was the dishonor. Forgetting was the real tragedy. By telling his story, he kept them alive. Every veteran who came home carried the ghosts of those who didn't. That was the burden, the weight that never lifted, the price of survival. But it was also the duty, the responsibility, to remember, to witness, to make sure the world knew what they'd given, what they'd sacrificed, to make sure that Virgil Pemberton from Iowa, who loved his family's farm and had a crooked smile, wasn't just a name on a memorial wall, to make sure that Billy Hutchins from Texas, who had a baby daughter with blonde curls, wasn't just a statistic. They were real people, with dreams and hopes and futures that got taken away. And as long as Woody could speak, as long as he could remember, they would live on. The birthday cake was brought out, a massive chocolate cake with 80 candles flickering in the dimming light, tiny flames dancing like stars. His family sang to him, their voices warm and full of love, happy birthday filling the room. Woody sat in his uniform, surrounded by the people who existed because he'd survived, because he'd come home, because he'd found a way to live with the memories and the guilt and the pain. He thought of Virgil one more time, imagining his friend standing there in the room with them, young and whole and smiling that crooked smile. "You did good, Woody. You lived a full life. You raised a family. You made it count. That's all any of us could ask for. You honored us by living well, by not giving up, by finally telling the story. We're not forgotten. As long as you remember, we're not forgotten. Woody closed his eyes and blew out the candles, and for the first time in 60 years, when he made his wish, it wasn't for the past to change, wasn't for Virgil to somehow still be alive, wasn't for the war to have never happened. It was for the future, for his grandsons and their children and their children's children, for a world where young men didn't have to jump out of airplanes into the darkness, where friends didn't die in the snow, where uniforms could stay in closets gathering dust because they were never needed again. He wished for peace, real lasting peace, the kind that Virgil and Billy and all the others had died trying to create. Bennett approached with his phone, holding it up. "Grandpa, can we take a picture? You in your uniform, all of us together? I want to remember this moment forever. I want to have this to show my kids someday." Woody nodded, understanding that this moment mattered, that this was part of passing on the memory, part of making sure the story continued. The family gathered around his chair, Garrett and Bennett kneeling on either side, Lawrence standing behind with his hands on his father's shoulders. Everyone close, everyone connected. The camera clicked, the flash bright, and in that frozen moment, 4 generations were connected. The soldier who'd fought and bled and somehow survived, the son who'd never fully understood until now, the grandsons who finally knew their grandfather's story, and the great-grandchildren yet to come who would hear these stories and remember. Who would know that freedom wasn't free, that it was bought with blood and sacrifice, that it was preserved by men like Elwood Callahan and Virgil Pemberton, and millions of others who answered the call when their country needed them. After the photo, after more cake and coffee and conversation, after the guests had left and the house grew quiet, Woody carefully removed the uniform. His hands lingered on the fabric one last time before folding it with military precision, the creases sharp and exact, the way he'd been taught at basic training a lifetime ago. He placed it back in the box, but this time, he knew it wouldn't be hidden away in the back of a closet. It would be displayed, honored, a tangible reminder of what he and millions like him had endured. Garrett had already talked about getting a display case, about putting the uniform and medals somewhere where they could be seen, where they could prompt questions and conversations, where they could teach. That night, after everyone had gone home, after Lawrence had driven back to his own house with promises to visit more often, after the cake had been put away and the dishes washed, Woody sat alone in his chair by the window. The moon was bright, casting silver light across the lawn, illuminating the garden that Evelyn had planted years ago and that he still maintained, pulling weeds and watering flowers because it made him feel close to her. He thought about the long journey from that scared 20-year-old paratrooper standing in England waiting to jump to the 80-year-old grandfather he was now. The path had been hard, marked by pain and loss and guilt that sometimes seemed unbearable, but it had also been marked by love, by family, by moments of grace and beauty. He'd survived when others hadn't, and he'd finally made peace with that. Virgil would have wanted him to live, to be happy, to find joy in the simple gift of another day. Billy Hutchins would have wanted him to cherish his family, to be the father that Billy never got to be. All the men who didn't come home, they'd want the survivors to live well, to make their sacrifice mean something. Woody closed his eyes and felt a presence beside him, familiar and warm, like sunshine on a cold day. He knew it was just his imagination, just the wishful thinking of an old man who'd outlived most of his generation. But for a moment, he could have sworn Virgil was sitting there in Evelyn's empty chair, young and whole and smiling, that crooked farm boy smile that had gotten them both through so much. "We made it, Virg," Woody whispered to the empty room, his voice barely audible. "Not all of us, but enough. Enough to remember. Enough to tell the story. Enough to make sure you're never forgotten. Your name will live on. My grandsons know about you now. They'll tell their children about the farm boy from Iowa who was the bravest man I ever knew. You'll live forever, as long as someone remembers." The moon continued its journey across the sky, stars wheeling overhead the way they had over Normandy and Bastogne and 100 other battlefields. Elwood Callahan, veteran of the 101st Airborne Division, survivor of Normandy and Market Garden and the Battle of the Bulge, holder of the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, sat in his chair and finally, truly, completely, came home from the war. The ghosts that had haunted him for 60 years were still there, would always be there, but they were no longer accusers. They were companions, brothers in arms, reminders of what he'd been part of what he'd survived, of what he owed to their memory. He would live the rest of his days honoring them, telling their stories, making sure that the sacrifice wasn't forgotten. And when his time finally came, when he closed his eyes for the last time, he knew he'd see Virgil again, and his friend would greet him with that crooked smile and say, "Took you long enough, Woody. Come on, brother. We got some catching up to do." If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more incredible true tales from history, please subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and let us know in the comments what historical story you'd like us to cover next. These stories matter, these voices need to be heard, and your support helps us keep telling them. Thank you for watching, and remember to honor our veterans not just with words, but by listening to their stories and passing them on to the next generation.